Welcome back to Think Design Work Smart. I'm Alex Bolboaca and I'm coming at you from the Mozaic Works studios. And what I have for you today is a few observations that I made regarding collaboration and a few collaboration challenges that I noted in teams that I worked with and in a more general context. So before I move on, I'd like to remind you that we really love comments. So if you find anything interesting in our videos, please leave a comment. We love to have conversations with you, the audience. Of course, we like subscriptions. We love when you like our videos. But in general, we are here for the conversation. So it's great to have comments. So let's go through these a little bit, and I'm going to explain what these things are. I was working with a team at some point doing some stuff, some activities related to increasing their level of business agility and basically moving them from where they are to the next level of product development. And this involved a number of things from product management to teams organization, and how to structure their processes and so on. So introducing some product discovery practices. But in doing so, I noticed a few things. And then I realized that these challenges were related to generational differences. And this is the first category that I like to talk about. Generations who grew up with phones have a different attitude towards physical presence and presence in general. So the way I would put it is that they are more used with virtualized relationships. So what I mean by virtualized relationships is relationships that are mediated through a communication medium. Like friendship would mean exchanging text messages on a chat application, or if you go on dates, you use an app to mediate this, and so on. So there are a bunch of things like that. And this creates a different perception of relationships. Whereas I would say older generations, where I'm also in generations before mobile phones were so widespread, or who didn't grow up with mobile phones, are more used with a less virtualized presence. So physical presence is more important. Video is more important. And you can see this in how they behave in groups, but also in how they behave in remote meetings. So for example, for newer generations, it might not be that important to have the camera turned on. You might have the camera turned off. And to this, there are a few other interesting things that happen. I've seen some psychological studies that mention the fact that generations who grew up with mobile phones, they tend to feel psychological pressure when they use video, because they were so used to being scrutinized, and so used with Instagram models and whatever. So if you are not Instagrammable at that point in time, that's a psychological pressure, and you would rather have your video turned off so that you don't feel scrutinized. Also, another thing is they are more used with asynchronous communication than with sync. So of course, these are all broad generalizations, but it's possible that many people in this generation would prefer text rather than real-time meetings or phone calls that add an additional psychological pressure. Now, I have to mention that this is not necessarily new. When I was a young software developer, I hated getting phone calls. And I know other people who did as well. So, and for a very long time, I had this psychological issue with not being able to take phone calls. I mean, I would feel a pressure to uh, talk on the phone. So and this is still there for me, but not as much as it used to be. It's a bit better. But now, and also asynchronous communication, this is how I kept in touch with many of my friends, especially when I worked abroad for many years. And that was really useful, actually. And I developed some of my relationships using asynchronous messages as well. So it's not something necessarily new, but it's a different maybe in accent or in preponderance. So keep this in mind when you are working with generations that grew up with mobile phones, then maybe some of these factors for psychological pressure would apply. And then people would you get this conflict, right? Because on one hand, you want to see, if you are in my generation, you'd prefer to see people who you are talking to on video, but for them, it might feel like it's a lot of pressure. So, and they don't necessarily enjoy it. So then this is a difference that needs to be somehow mediated or discussed, and you need to understand each other and kind of find a middle ground there. Maybe for some meetings you open the video, for others you don't. Now, the second one, this is more general. It's not generational, but it's about the relationship between speaking and thinking. And I noticed that there are two types of people, or maybe two types of behaviors. There's one behavior that is speak to think, and another behavior that is think to speak. So let's go to the extreme, okay? Let's assume that there are some people who just speak to think and some people who just think to speak. We'll see that that's not the case, but let's go with this for a while so that we understand what we are talking about. So for some people, they need to think before they say anything. So this would mean that they hear something and they need to wait a little bit to process, to consider, and they need a little bit of silence to get their thoughts in order before they can answer. You could say it's a more analytical oriented type of behavior, although not necessarily, but yeah, you might see this. On the other hand, you have people who speak to think, because the act of speaking something actually involves thinking. And often what happens is that you would go state a problem, and by stating the problem to a colleague, you realize that you found the solution and you don't need help for the colleague. This is an example of speak to think, but there are also others. It's when you have an idea that's not completely formed and you speak about it, and by speaking about it, it becomes a little bit clearer, and then you get an answer, and using the answer, you refine your idea and you go kind of back and forth. And then you have this speak to think way of dealing with problems. In a way, this YouTube channel is my way of speaking to think, right? I'm a person who prefers to think before they speak, but in this channel, I have to practice, and this is one of the reasons why I love doing this. I practice speak to think. I speak about stuff and I understand it better while speaking about it. Now, what happens when you put these two types together, where one of them will speak? So you take a problem, they will speak the problem. The other person will stop and try to think, but the first person will continuously try to speak and get an answer, and maybe get frustrated because they don't get what they need, which is a feedback so that they can move on and kind of have a ping pong. On the other hand, the other person is annoyed because they don't get the necessary time to reflect and to answer, right? So you get this challenge between these two types of people. Now, I mentioned that we'll discuss it in the extreme. In reality, you have a mix, right? So there are problems that you speak to think. There are people with whom you speak to think. And then there are problems or times in the day where you need to think to speak. So not everybody is doing this full. I mean, I don't think there is anybody who does this completely full time, only one mode of operation. But when these two modes of operations don't fit, you get a bit of a challenge in communication and collaboration. So I think there are no easy way of dealing with this, but the first step is to identify in which mode you are and in which mode is your the other person that you try to discuss with. And if you are in two different modes, you can at least, well, you can try to move into one mode, so one of you could move into the other mode. Or the person who speaks to think, you can have a little bit of patience to wait for a feedback slightly more and understand that this is normal, that this is what you need. Now, there might also be the case that the reason for think to speak is because it's in a difficult context. So then maybe you need to change the context. For example, if it's a complex problem that you give to a person who usually thinks before they speak, and they don't fully understand the problem, they don't fully understand the context, and at the same time, a wrong answer can have very bad consequences, then you might get into this challenge, into a block, right? So it's useful to do this in contexts that are less prone to bad consequences. It's useful to have a psychologically safe space. So maybe you just frame it, okay, let's just ping pong some ideas. Let's just do this, okay? And it's fine. You can tell me anything. I won't hold you to it. We are just trying to figure out this thing, and I need your help to do this. And if you frame it like this, it's good as long as you keep your word and you don't hold anyone responsible for this. Or it can be framed as a brainstorming, or, so there are a few ways in which you can do this. You can ease the burden there. But once again, it's about the psychological, there are some psychological forces involved. And one of them is the fear of not saying something wrong. I had a lot of people in in course is saying we don't have any questions because we don't want to ask a wrong question. There are no wrong questions. You can always ask questions. You can always ask clarification questions. I didn't understand that. What do you mean by that? Is this more similar to X or more similar to Y? So there are all kind of questions that a person that is usually in the mode of thinking to speaking can ask more or less automatically in order to clarify a little bit more what's going on there. So, and this allows you to answer or to have a ping pong of ideas without frustrating the other person, and do this easier, right? And without having a wrong answer. Let's say if that's your fear. All right. And the third one is something that I've seen recently on Mastodon. So Mastodon is federated social media structure, let's say, which means that you have different instances that are connected together, and each instance has its own instance owner who can make some rules regarding that instance. And recently there has been a bit of how would I say, an incident related to one of these instances where one of the moderators was caught distributing some right-wing thoughts on other parts of the media. But what they said is, when confronted with this, they said that, I never make decisions based only on that and so on. But anyway, it was a whole thing. And for me, besides all these details, and which are honestly, for my programmer head, these tend to be very complicated. I tend to avoid these kinds of problems because they are quite complex. But one thing that I noticed is there's a cultural difference between what I would call localized and global behavior. So it used to be that your identity was very fragmented on the internet. You might have an identity on, let's say you had 10 different forums. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about forums if you remember those. Let's say you are on 10 different forums, you might have 10 different identities. Okay, they had the same email address, but that email address was not visible, only your handle. And so your identity was split into different localized forums. And then the only thing that mattered was your behavior inside that specific forum. If you are following the rules there, even though you're doing something very awful in another forum, it was very difficult to link your behavior, right? And to figure out who you are and if you're the same person in forum number 9 as you are in forum number 2. Or in forum number 2, you're a troll and you get kicked out, but in forum number 9 you follow all the rules and everything is fine. So, and I think there's a culture of localized behavior for some of these older style, let's say, what would I say, instance owners who think about how only about the local behavior. This is the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter what you're doing outside that. It only matters how you behave here. Whereas there's another culture that has caught on with the integration of internet services, where the global behavior matters. So even if you behave properly in one forum, if you did something bad in another forum, people will come and tell you, that's, we have a problem with you. And once again, it's a little bit tricky because these two cultures clash, right? For one culture, it's important that you have your default behavior, which is global, is good and maybe not ideal, but at least, you follow the rules, the social acceptable rules. Whereas in another, for the other culture, if somebody comes and say, yeah, but on that forum you said this, what the reaction would be is, yeah, but here he's been a really good citizen, so why would that matter, And so you get this clash. And okay, this is not as often seen in organizations, but I think it has become a little bit of an issue in the sense that organizations, particularly large organizations, will look at social media activity when hiring people. And honestly, I'm not sure if that's such a great idea. But, it's the same thing. What does it matter? Does it matter that you are working effectively here inside the team, or does it matter that your global behavior is great? And I think each team, each organization, each social structure needs to figure this out on their own because it's getting more and more complicated. But you can see how this can become a cultural clash and a communication issue and a collaboration issue within teams and not only. All right, so these are some of my observations about challenges in collaboration. I'm curious what you think about this. Have you met any of these challenges? Let us know in the comments. As I said, we love comments and we love to have more interactions with you. Thank you kindly for the view, and until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart. See you next Saturday.